First of all, I have to preface it by saying that the history of photography has been something that I've not only been extremely interested, not just by being a photographer, but even beyond that. And since I think the first project I did about it was in 1981, and I've done 3 or 4 bodies of work that have specifically to do with the history of photography. Okay, so it keeps coming up. It's a leitmotif in the work that I do. In fact, in the early 80s, I published another book that had to do with the history of photography where, this was way before Photoshop, where I actually collaged myself into a number of famous photographs, and it's called Some Significant Self-Portraits. In any case, The Americans by Car came about because I was working actually on a more recent body of work, and I was trying to put a book together involving that. And I was really hitting a wall when it came to sequencing the photographs. I just had a real problem. I knew that this idea about making a book that had to do with Robert Frank and Lee Friedlander was something that I would be eventually interested in. I had it shelved in the back of my mind for a number of years. And I just thought, okay, I'll do it when I have the time. But since this body of work was giving me so much trouble in terms of putting one photograph in relationship to another, I decided I'm going to switch to this right now because it's going to be, it's not going to offer that complexity. And the reason that it's not, and I should explain a little bit about the concept of the book, is that Robert Frank, born in Switzerland, emigrated to the United States in 1947, I think, drove around the country in the mid-1950s for 2 years and photographed America. He put the images together as a book and had a lot of trouble publishing it. It actually was first published in France, but in 1958 it came out in America. And it's still in print, and it is pretty much without argument considered to be the most influential photography book of the second half of the 20th century. So thousands, if not tens of thousands, of photography students have been raised on Robert Frank and the Americans, including me. And there was one particular edition, the 1969 edition, that I remember going over and over until the pages fell out. And so, obviously, Frank and Lee Friedlander, who was the second generation, the generation after Robert Frank, were very big influences to me. So, without having any of this in the front of my mind, starting in, I don't know, maybe 2008 or 2009, I got involved in photographing from my car. I'd see something, and I would stop the car, and I would use the inside window frames and door frames of the car as formal constructs, as compositional elements, inside, outside, that sort of thing. And so when I decided to put this project of new work on hold and went back to the Robert Frank book, okay, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to go back into my archives, and the idea was not to make any new pictures, okay? I ended up making 1 or 2 because I had to, but in general, I went back into my archives and tried to find a photograph that I took from the car that had a resonance, that had some kind of a correspondence with every photograph in the Americans. So that's 83 photographs. And so after about a month of frantic searching, I came up with what I thought were 83 photographs, each one corresponding to a specific photograph in the Americans. And so I laid them out in the sequence that the Americans is laid out. So that solved my problem of sequencing that I was having with the other book. Okay, I mean, so I came to this book because I said, I'm having so much trouble with that other book that here's something I don't have to worry about the sequencing, okay? So the idea of this book, of The Americans by Karl, is it's a kind of conflation between the work of Robert Frank and the work of Lee Friedlander, but primarily Robert Frank, because at this point, he is the more influential artist. And it's essentially about influence. In other words, I was going back through my old photographs to try and see how much I had been unconsciously influenced by these photographers, okay? If you look at the Americans and you're familiar with the Americans, you know, if you pass an American flag, you'll photograph it. If you pass a gas station, you'll photograph it, because these are motifs that keep appearing in the Americans. And you don't necessarily realize that that's why you're doing it, but because you've had so much access to this book, it fits in. So that is the idea of the book. It's about influence. And once I started, it was just a matter of getting it out of my system. I just worked solid for a month, found the images, put them in sequence, and then the only problem that was left was that Jack Kerouac, the writer, was good friends with Robert Frank, and he wrote the introduction to The Americans, which I recommend reading because it's in his crazy style, and it's really a piece of beautiful work. I could not have Jack Kerouac write the introduction to my book. Yet, my book says on the front that it has an introduction by Jack Kerouac, and it does. And I'm not going to tell you what it is. You have to look at the book to find out, okay? While I'm at it, I should show you that this is the edition of The Americans that I grew up with. This is my own copy. And so you can see there's sort of a correspondence. And I tried to keep the typeface similar, but also add my own little parts of it, so it was part his and part mine. I also intentionally wanted to keep the book smaller because I thought it was arrogant enough to try and face off with this guy. So it was sort of a gesture of humility. And really, so paradoxically, the book is a tribute or an homage, and at the same time, it's kind of a parody or a satire. My book, by its nature, has to be a dialogue with Robert Frank and Lee Friedlander. Again, I say primarily Robert Frank. And there is a span of 50 years between when he did his book and I did my book, all right? Obviously, America has changed. I have to say that I am not in any way putting myself anywhere near the plateau that Robert Frank has achieved. And these two figures, Frank and Friedlander, are giants, and I recognize that, and I am not in any sense trying to compete with them. However, it was actually something that came to mind as I was, again, I wasn't shooting for this, I was going back and looking for pictures. It was a concern that America had changed visually, and So many of the motifs that Robert Frank had recurring in his book were things that I actually tried to make comment on. One very obvious example, if you're familiar with the book, is the jukebox. Now, Robert Frank took some photographs from his car that are in this book, but mostly there were photographs from outside the car, from walking around the street or going into restaurants or going into bars or people's homes, that sort of thing. And the jukebox and the television, which was very new to popular culture in 1958 or 1955, 1956 when he took the pictures, are important elements in the book. They have changed considerably, okay? People do not usually go into restaurants or bars and listen to jukeboxes anymore. The way they receive music has changed radically, and I think that I tried to make the pictures reflect that. There's also a question of directions and roads and maps and things like that that appear in his that appear in his book, which I have also updated in terms of how we negotiate things with a GPS or an iPhone or something like that. But each of those pictures also contains an element that refers back to his original photograph. So those are a couple of the examples. Some things actually stay the same. The final picture in Robert Frank's Americans is a picture of his wife looking very tired, sitting in the front seat of his car. Okay? The picture that is the final picture of the Americans by car is a picture of my wife and daughter looking very tired, sitting in my car. Again, this was taken before I had the idea for the book, but the influence was probably there. I've been a photographer for almost 45 years. 35 of those years, I worked almost exclusively in black and white, and when I worked in color, it was the more traditional darkroom color. I switched to digital in the mid-2000s, and I made the decision that digital capture in a camera is the way it sees the real world, and that's in color. And so I was going to take that as a given, and for me to take a digital picture and turn it into black and white because it looks better, to me is really a more, it's an aesthetic choice, but that's really a euphemism. It's more a stylistic or a formulaic choice. So my philosophical decision is to photograph in color because the world is in color. And so the pictures that I took from my car from 2008 to whenever the book was published are pictures that are all taken in color. So that was one of the rules of establishing this book. Even though it's a visual book, it has a very specific conceptual framework. And I think that I've alluded to that before. So when you do something that is conceptual in nature, very often there are rules. You can do this, but you can't do that. You have to stay within these parameters. So I decided that the parameters that I would stay within were that, in general, I would not make any new pictures. Number two, the pictures had to be from the car, or in some cases, outside the car, but have a car as a prominent element in the picture. And three, that they had to be in color, because the body of work that I was drawing from was all in color. And so today, my work is primarily in color, although there is still one project that I continue to do in black and white film and will continue to do that. On February 23rd, 1987, I set up a little white backdrop in a closet, put a camera on a tripod, and took a picture of my face. I have taken a picture of my face every day since then. On February 27th, 2017, that'll mark 30 years. Actually, I did forget one day, but since I started that project with film, I continue it with film. It's a lifelong project. I have a portable tripod and a portable background, and I just bring the camera and I set it up in whatever corner of the room that I am staying in. To take the picture at my house takes 5 minutes. To take it if I'm on the road, it takes 15 minutes. It's not a lot of effort. The effort comes when I have to show it, and I have to put all the pictures together. I've made a number of videos. I've done a number of installations in galleries and museums. I try to do something once a year. And I actually, this is also obviously a conceptual project. And when I first started the project, I realized that to me it was about 4 things. It was about mortality. It was about obsession. It was about incremental change. And it was about the difference between trying to be perfect and being human. In other words, there are plenty of mistakes that I make when I do this, but I try in my mind to make each picture as close to the days before's picture, as close to the picture that I took the day before as possible, even though I know it's impossible. So those were the 4 parameters that I started with. When I exhibit the work, I try and exhibit it in a different manner or context or medium than I did before. And actually, in the past 10 years, I have added another. I've added another aspect to the conceptual part of this project, which is that I collaborate with people. For example, when I had the 20th anniversary of this project exhibited at my gallery in Boston, which is the Miller Yuzurski Gallery, that was 1987. I'm sorry, that was 2007. And what I did was I took a picture, every picture, made a small print of every picture. We put them all up on the walls, and people could buy them for $10 a piece. And we sold thousands, obviously. I think there were 7,000 pictures to begin with. But as a condition of buying the piece, they would have to send me a picture of where the picture was. In other words, did they frame it and put it up on the wall? Was it in their shirt drawer? Was it in the bottom of their garbage pail? It didn't matter. They just had to send me a picture, and they had to tell me why they picked the date they did, because every picture was individually dated and signed, okay? So I got maybe 100 responses and did a small online book of the responses, which range from very poignant and sad to hilarious, absolutely hilarious. The other thing is that I teach a class called Art and Digital Technology, which is basically a class in Photoshop. And I started teaching this class in 1998 or 1999. And for the second assignment in the class, I would give the students a picture of my face from that series and say, look, just play around with this. If you don't like me, turn me into the devil, whatever. It was a way of assessing their Photoshop skills. After 3 or 4 years of doing this, I realized that I had been taking my picture longer than many of my students had been alive. So now what I do is it's always the second assignment, and I get everybody's date of birth, and I send them a picture of my face on the day that they were born. And I ask them to collaborate with me and work with the picture in Photoshop with the idea that it represents something about their date of birth. It can be personal, it can be about their family, it can be about what happened in the world, whatever. But so this idea has shifted. Well, it hasn't exactly shifted. The 4 original components of the idea are still valid to me, but there's also this idea of a connecting point of the day that I did this and you did that. Well, if I had to make a bet, I would bet that it has not ended, that the dialogue will continue, perhaps with Robert Frank and or Lee Friedlander, perhaps with somebody else. But the reason I say that is because in the 4 decades that I've been a photographer, I have come back to that touchstone of making work that refers to the history of photography over and over again. So I don't have any specific ideas about doing it for anybody in particular now, but I've done it so many times, I'm probably going to do it again. I mean, that seems to be part of who I am as a photographer.